Hey guys, I'm Reed Coverdale, and you're watching The Naturalist Capitalist, and I've got Mike back on the show again. How you doing, Mike?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. So today we're going to talk a little bit about bad optics but good policy. So the extremely controversial topic right now is the Anti-Lynching Act, and Rand Paul is the only senator who's not voting for it. So what all the headlines are saying is Rand Paul supports lynching, or Rand Paul not opposed to lynching, Rand Paul holds up lynching act. So they're framing it as though he is against the idea of making lynching a federal hate crime. But the fact is, lynching already is a crime federally, and it's a federal hate crime. The only thing this bill seems to do is expand the definition of what lynching is, and therefore expand mandatory minimums, the death penalty, and all sorts of punishments that Rand Paul has uh, he's dedicated his entire career fighting against. So he's even said, I will vote for this bill if you accept my amendment that exclusively defines lynching as just lynching and doesn't extend it to lesser crimes. So that seems like something that's reasonable, but especially in today's climate, if you are against any sort of political gesture or symbolic legislation, you're instantly demonized. It brings me back to last year with the 9/11 first responders bill that he blocked, and it was the same exact deal. He had an amendment that took spending away from some stupid programs we have, and he always illustrates what these stupid programs are. He'll say we're spending $9 million building a gas station in Iran or whatever, or wherever it is, not Iran, but in somewhere, and then we spend like $800,000 studying why drunk people fall over faster than sober people. And so he says, we got all these crazy things we're doing. Let's take that money and put it toward something like this that actually matters. But it just gets flipped around to saying that he's against whatever the bill is trying to support. So how do we fight against this? Like I just try to post articles explaining Rand Paul's criminal justice record and how he's the best senator on criminal justice, like better than Bernie Sanders or any of the Democrats, definitely the best Republican on it. This is the power of the media and the public opinion of what's popular to stop good legislation from going through. So what do we do? Like, how do we fight that? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, I've often heard it said that many times if you want to push a bill through in Congress, you need to come up with a snappy title that's broadly based and does not necessarily resemble what's actually in the bill. They call it anti-lynching, but what percentage of the bill actually pertains to what they're actually pitching it as? Yeah, I think of like the Patriot Act, where they labeled this whole surveillance state, and the impetus of it came by calling us a patriot for endorsing it. What does one have to do with the other, right?
Right.
It's
Yeah.
Form over substance, I think, sometimes, the way some of these things in Washington happen.
Yeah, definitely. It got me to think back to what one of the foundational problems that we have with racial inequality when it comes to criminal justice is really the drug war. And in my opinion, at least, we had slavery, and then we had the Three-Fifths Compromise, and then we had Jim Crow laws, and then finally the Civil Rights Act came around, and then after that, the government decided, oh, we still need something to keep these people in line. Let's start the drug war. And they sold it as this benevolent thing to get drugs off the street, to, you know, help our youth, to keep people clean. But in reality, when you look at what the policies do, it ends up hurting the people that they're claiming they're trying to help. It hurts young kids, especially kids, minority kids in poor neighborhoods, and they end up in jail, and then they can't get a job because they have a record, so they end up back in jail. And it's just this continued cycle that benefits the prison industrial complex. It benefits the drug dealers, frankly. You know, it benefits everybody that, if Main Street America knew benefiting from it, they'd be furious, but they were able to sell it to the public, and they just took it hook, line, and sinker. And it's what, like 50 years later now, and we're still doing the same thing. I feel like it's finally starting to bleed out of just poor minority neighborhoods and starting to go into other places where they're realizing it, and drugs are starting to get legalized, and people are starting to finally realize that mandatory minimums and all these things don't work. So that that good optics on a bill that was really bad is finally starting to be exposed. But I feel like this never happens beforehand, and there are always people who realize that this is the case. They realize this isn't going to help anyone, this is only going to hurt them, but no one listens to them. And then a ton of time has to go by where we deal with the repercussions of it, and then finally people wake up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know. Well, you know, you think about the war on drugs. I mean, you know, not only are they targeting poor people, but it disproportionately seems to hit minorities too, for reasons that, you know, many people like Rand and Thomas Massey have pointed out, that, you know, it's creating a racial outcome where more of the people are ending up in prison that are of color than white, but arguably the whites are using it just as much as the colored people are. So, you know, there's a lot wrong with it. And, you know, the real question is, you know, why is it taking 50 years to repeal it? Because it's doubled prison populations and doubled them again. And, you know, it just turns the poorest people among us who are looking for a way to get ahead in life, and they see the guy down the street who's made all his money selling drugs, and he's the one that's got the expensive car, you know. So, you know, it really affects people in poor neighborhoods because they don't see the same avenues of opportunity that other people do. So that's, you know, it has many different effects on things too, you know.
Right. Yeah. So I feel like Democrats and Republicans are starting to realize that the war on drugs was a farce. What Democrats are not admitting is that the war on poverty was a complete joke. And, you know, that all these policies that were supposed to lift people out of poverty, that they've actually really kept them in poverty. I would say that free market capitalism has actually ended extreme poverty, because household items like air conditioning and, you know, a phone and things like that, people who are really poor can buy those things now because of the free market. But when it comes to necessities like housing, automobiles, healthcare, college education, those are all the things that are skyrocketing. And what do all those have in common? They've all had an intervention in the markets, you know, that have made them more expensive. So I feel like something that a lot of progressives are pushing right now is we need like reparations, or we need more social programs to fix this problem. And that is also blind in my eyes. They're not looking back at the last, I think the war on poverty has been going on about the same amount of time the war on drugs has, and how it's not solved any problems. And they just don't want to admit that, no, the government making these rules has only hurt people. We need to get the government out of the way. We need to let the marketplace work. and we need to stop punishing people for victimless crimes. And that's really the way to let
Yeah.
people bring themselves out of poverty. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think the war on poverty started in the 60s. And the argument that I've heard is that there are as many poor people today as there were when they started it, on a statistical basis. So, it hasn't really worked in pulling people out of poverty. It just creates um, that, what's the word? It created the needy class that the Democrats like to have so that they can get reelected because, hey, I'm handing you something that you want. So vote for me because I'm the one that's going to fight for you to get more of what we're offering, these social programs,
Right.
So they're key to getting reelected.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people act like when we point that out that we're demonizing these people, and that's not it at all. We're just trying to expose that the Democratic Party has had a thumb on them forever because they've convinced them that they need all this stuff when they don't. It's really holding them back, holding them down. I think the Democrats' worst possible nightmare is that the the poor rise above poverty. Like that would be their worst nightmare ever because then they'd lose all those votes. They want to have that continued influx of voters who vote for the welfare state when we want to get people off the welfare state. It's not that we think they're low lives or something. We just want them to be free of this oppression, and we want them to live happily. And I think that we've been painted as evil capitalists who just don't care about poor people, and that's just really not what the case is.
But the fact is, if you don't, one of the biggest hurdles to getting, especially as a young person, getting a start is the minimum wage because what is it, $15 an hour now? If you're just starting out and you can't earn $15 an hour to somebody who's hiring, why would they hire you?
Yeah.
I mean, when I started working, I was working for less than minimum wage as a teenager. But you know what? I got my foot in the door. I learned an awful lot, and it taught me a lot of things about myself at that young age. So I could, actually be worth something to an employer someday down the line. And you're not born with that good work ethic. You really need to learn that and work at it. And
Right.
I think the amount of people that are unemployed today, before we even got into this COVID nonsense, we had these high unemployment rates, coming out of the Obama years and even going into Trump. And it seems like the political football that gets thrown around every so often so we can say, well, we did something to try and say we don't want poor people anymore. So we're going to raise the minimum wage, take that bottom rung off the ladder so that people will make more money. And, I understand what they're trying to do because they're saying, hey, we want to find a way to make employers pay their workers more. But that's not the way to do it,
Right. Yeah, I mean, the minimum wage is a great example of that. I think another thing is occupational licensing. I mean, I think there are some jobs that you should have a license for, like you and I are truck drivers. I think it's completely reasonable to have a CDL. But I think if you're a hairdresser or if you're a florist or if you're I don't even know I mean, there's tons of like dumb jobs that you need to get a license for, and you have to get schooling for them. It takes time, it takes money. Who's benefiting from all these things? Is it the people who need the jobs, or is it the people who are making money off all the classes and all the licenses? This is another great example of good optics, bad policy, because people think, oh, the more training we have, the more licensing we have, the better people are going to be at their jobs. But a lot of these
Right.
jobs, you just don't need those things, and it just helps the bureaucracy grow.
Well, what are these licenses? Most of it is you need to pay a fee to the government and fill out this form with your name and address. It usually not much more complicated than that. If you're
Right.
if you're going to be trying to prove that you actually know how to cut hair, I don't know where that actually comes in on the license. Maybe you went to school for it, but you could have slept through all your classes and still graduated. I mean, it's one thing doesn't relate to the other sometimes, the way these policies are written.
Right. Yeah. Um, Something that's actually 100 years old, either yesterday or the day before, is the Jones Act. And this was another thing it looked good, but it's done nothing but destroy business. So I think the idea behind the Jones Act is if a foreign ship is porting in the United States, it has to go out of the country again before it can port another time to drop off cargo. I think that's the way it works. It can only unload once, and then it has to go to another country before it can unload again. And the idea was to protect our shipping industry from competition. But I was listening to Peter Schiff yesterday, and apparently, I forget what the number is of ships in the whole world that go over the ocean, but it's in the tens of thousands. We have 98 in the United States that can go internationally. So 98 ships. We make like 2 or 3 a year. And then he read off the numbers of the ships that are built in other countries. They're in the hundreds per year that are built. And it's because it's so much cheaper to build them there. It costs so much money to build them here in the United States. So what we have is people wonder why everything is trucked so much in the United States, why a truck brings something everywhere. Why doesn't a ship do it more? Why do we truck things up to Alaska instead of shipping them up to Alaska? Or why can't a ship drop something off in Hawaii on its way over to California? Why does it have to go to California? And it's because of the Jones Act. That's a huge problem. And if we want to cut down on carbon emissions, a ship is by far the most fuel effective way to get goods from one place to another, not by truck or train, it's by ship. But this law has been with us 100 years and it still hasn't been repealed. I think Ron Paul introduced legislation to try to repeal it several years ago. And then the other thing that's interesting is politicians from Alaska and Hawaii usually support this bill, but it's not because it will benefit their constituents. It's because the lobbyists pay them off. Because if you go to Hawaii or Alaska, everything costs so much more money. Groceries are through the roof. Gas is more expensive. Everything, because it's got to be shipped or transported in such a convoluted way. And so there are still lobbyists trying to pay off politicians to get the public to think that this law that we've had for literally 100 years is helping us, when it's killing American jobs, it's driving prices up, and it's driving carbon emissions up. So it's just amazing the influence that lobbyists and the government have on constituents, when they really just need to open their eyes and say, oh wow, this law is what's causing us all this strife. What do you think about all that?
Well, I understand where Peter Schiff is coming from with the Jones Act, because he lives in Puerto Rico, so he can actually speak to the actual effects that it has. The way I understand it, it means that if goods are going from one U.S. port to another, it needs to be on a United States ship. So
Right.
if we're sending goods from Los Angeles to Hawaii, there's only so many ships, and even though there's so many ships going right past anyway, they couldn't go directly from China to Hawaii. I think they'd have to go to Los Angeles and then get on another ship to go to Hawaii or something like that. But the government is notorious for breaking your leg and then offering you a crutch and wondering why you're not grateful for the crutch that they offer you.
Right.
So
yeah, I mean, I feel like people in general just think we need more regulation, we need more government. It's been such a popular selling point that all our issues are because we don't have enough regulation, enough government telling us what to do. We don't have enough redistribution of wealth. We don't. I used to honestly think that way in some areas, but when you start digging into how the government works, how the economy works, how many stupid laws we still have, I've really realized that the problem is the government, and that we really just need to start repealing dumb laws that we have. This friend of mine and I came up with this idea of the No Party. And if you were part of the No Party, if there were any new laws, you always had to vote no. And if there were any repeals, you always had to vote yes. And the only exception was you could vote yes for a new law if it restricted government even more. And the first law that we would push for is a 10-year sunset clause on every single law we have outside of constitutional laws. So every 10 years, the House and Senate and the president would have to reauthorize whatever federal law we had, and that would be a good way of getting rid of a bunch of these stupid ideas. But that's the message we got to convey to people, and we got to bring it home. We got to show them this is how the government has messed up your life. This is how regulations and stupid ideas have ruined your business or your career path or whatever. So that's what I'm trying to do with this show. That's why I have you on, because you're a real world person who's dealt with a lot of these things, and I have too. But I'm just hoping we can really bring that message home.
So, with regards to what you were just talking about, it reminds me of an organization I came across back when Ron Paul was running for president in 2008. There's an organization called Downsize DC, and they came up with a number of different acts. For example, they have one called One Subject at a Time. So if you
right.
up with a bill, you should have, say, it should only be regarding one subject instead of like these omnibus bills, which are thousands and thousands of pages. And it's just, slush fund for X, Y, and Z product. And, if you go to downsizedc.com, you can find the list of them and join the list, and you can see what kind of progress they've made. Make a donation if you feel like it, but they're a pretty good organization that's been around for a while, trying to get politicians to actually do something useful for a change.
Right. Yeah. Well, this is actually one of the reasons I liked Tulsi Gabbard, was because I thought that she would, she was taking some controversial stands. She went to Syria to meet with Assad, and she wasn't pushing for some of the things the Democrats were. I think that I always look for that in a person, but there's nobody in Congress I know who's more willing to put his head on a chopping block than Rand Paul. I mean, and I have some policy disagreements with him, not too many, but I do. But that's why I love him, and that's why he still has my support, because he's always willing to just commit suicide for his principles. And we need more people like that, because we've only got a few of them. We got Miss Massey and him, and sometimes a couple other people. But that's really attractive to me. I'll just give you the last word. Anything else you want to say, and then we'll close out.
No, I thought it was a pretty interesting discussion today. So, give people something to think about, and maybe what the government is selling is not what they're actually saying what it is. You really need to dig a little deeper and figure out, do the statistics actually, paying out what they're trying to sell. So,
All
but
right.
yeah,
Well, thanks for coming on again, Mike, and we'll have you back on soon.
yep. Talk to you again soon.
All right. Thanks, guys. Tune in next time. This has been Naturalist Capitalist.